On the morning of August 6, 1945, Colonel Paul Tibbets sat in the pilot's seat of a B-29 Superfortress he had named after his own mother, Enola Gay, and guided the aircraft toward the Japanese city of Hiroshima, carrying a single bomb, unlike anything ever used in the history of warfare. 12 men were aboard that aircraft, and a handful more flew supporting missions alongside it that morning, each of them about to become part of an event that would end the deadliest war in human history and open an entirely new and terrifying chapter in it at the same time. What almost none of them could have fully anticipated in the tense hours leading up to the release of that single bomb was how completely differently each of their lives would unfold in the decades that followed. From a pilot who defended the mission without a flicker of public doubt until the day he died, to a man on a related mission who spent the rest of his life consumed by a guilt so severe it destroyed him. This is the story of what actually happened to the men who dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, and how unevenly history, memory, and their own consciences treated them afterward. The strategic decision to use the atomic bomb at all, a decision made at levels of American government and military leadership far above Tibbets and his crew, rested on a calculation that had been building through the final months of the Pacific War, as American planners weighed the enormous projected casualties, on both the American and Japanese sides, that an eventual invasion of the Japanese home islands was expected to produce, against the comparatively swifter, if horrifically destructive, alternative a single devastating weapon might offer. This broader strategic and political context sat entirely outside the control or direct decision-making of the 12 men who actually flew the mission, a distinction that would matter considerably to how several of them, in later decades, chose to describe their own individual moral responsibility for a decision that had, in the most literal sense, already been made by the time they climbed into the aircraft that morning. The Enola Gay's mission on August 6th was the culmination of months of secretive, highly specialized training conducted by the 509th Composite Group, a unit assembled specifically to deliver atomic weapons, and trained extensively in the unusual flight profile the mission required, including a steep, diving turn immediately after bomb release, designed to put maximum distance between the aircraft and the blast in the seconds before detonation. Colonel Paul Tibbets, an experienced and highly regarded B-29 pilot who had already flown combat missions over Europe earlier in the war, was selected to command the unit and personally chose the crew that would fly the mission's lead aircraft, a decision-making process that reflected his own exacting standards for the technical skill and composure the mission demanded. The crew Tibbets assembled for the Hiroshima mission included co-pilot Captain Robert Lewis, Bombardier Major Thomas Farabee, Navigator Captain Theodore Van Kirk, Weaponeer Navy Captain William Parsons, who would personally arm the bomb in flight after takeoff to reduce the risk of detonation in the event of a crash during the takeoff roll. Assistant Weaponeer Second Lieutenant Morris Jepson, Radar Countermeasures Officer Lieutenant Jacob Besser, and several additional crew members handling engineering, radio, and gunnery duties, including tail gunner Staff Sergeant George Caron, who would capture the mission's most enduring photographic image, the rising mushroom cloud, from his position at the rear of the aircraft. The 509th Composite Group's training regimen, conducted largely at a remote airbase in Utah before the unit deployed to the Pacific, involved practicing with specially modified B-29s carrying inert practice bombs matching the size and weight of the real weapon, allowing crews to rehearse the specific evasive maneuver the mission required, without the crews themselves being told the full nature of what they were actually preparing to deliver. This compartmentalized secrecy meant that even among the crew of the Enola Gay itself, only a small number of officers, chiefly Tibbets and the weaponeers responsible for the bomb's technical assembly, understood the full scope and destructive power of the weapon before the mission actually began, a level of operational secrecy consistent with the broader security surrounding the entire Manhattan Project. The mission itself proceeded with a level of technical precision that reflected months of specialized preparation. The Enola Gay releasing its bomb, codenamed Little Boy, over Hiroshima at approximately 8:15 in the morning local time, followed immediately by Tibbets's practiced diving turn away from the target as the weapon detonated below. Crew members later described the shock wave striking the aircraft with a force strong enough to be felt physically even at the distance the escape maneuver had achieved, followed by the sight, for those with a view toward the target, of a column of smoke and debris rising to an altitude that several crew members described as unlike anything they had witnessed in their previous combat experience, whatever their individual branch or role in the war up to that point. The immediate aftermath for the crew involved a return flight to Tinian, conducted largely in a state several later described as stunned, subdued quiet, a marked contrast to the celebratory atmosphere that had sometimes accompanied the crews of conventional bombing missions returning from successful strikes earlier in the war. Robert Lewis, the co-pilot, reportedly wrote observations in the aircraft's log during and immediately after the mission that several biographers and historians have since cited as reflecting a level of emotional and moral weight he felt in the moment, phrasing that, whatever its exact original wording, has become one of the more frequently referenced first-hand reactions from anyone aboard the aircraft that day. The decision to arm the bomb only after the aircraft was already airborne, a procedure Parsons personally carried out in the aircraft's bomb bay during the early hours of the flight rather than having the weapon fully armed before takeoff, reflected a specific and carefully considered safety calculation. Mission planners judged the risk of a catastrophic accidental detonation during a failed takeoff, given the enormous weight of fuel and ordnance the heavily loaded aircraft was carrying, to be significant enough that arming the weapon only once safely airborne represented the more prudent course, a procedure that required Parsons and Jepson to perform a delicate technical assembly process in a cramped, poorly lit bomb bay, while the aircraft was already in flight, a task neither man had the luxury of rehearsing under truly identical conditions beforehand. In the years and decades following the mission, the surviving crew members of the Enola Gay diverged sharply in how they processed, discussed, and lived with their role in the attack, a divergence that mirrors, in its own specific way, the broader and unresolved moral debate historians and the public have continued to have about the bombing itself. Paul Tibbets became, and remained for the rest of his long life, the mission's most consistent and outspoken public defender, giving interviews across many decades in which he stated repeatedly and without equivocation that he had no regrets whatsoever about his role in the mission, framing it consistently as a necessary act that, in his own calculation, ultimately saved far more lives, American and Japanese alike, than it took by avoiding the far bloodier ground invasion of the Japanese home islands that American military planners had been actively preparing to launch. Tibbets went on to a long and successful career in the United States Air Force following the war, eventually reaching the rank of brigadier general before his retirement, and he remained a prominent public figure specifically associated with the mission for the remainder of his life, participating in documentaries, historical commemorations, and public discussions of the bombing well into his 80s. He died in November of 2007, and, in a detail that itself speaks to the controversy that continued to surround the mission even decades later, he had specifically requested no funeral service and no gravestone, reportedly out of concern that a permanent, identifiable memorial site might become a target for the kind of protest and vandalism that had, at points during his lifetime, targeted memorials and events connected to the bombing. Robert Lewis's own post-war trajectory, distinct from both Tibbets's forceful public advocacy and Eatherly's documented collapse, occupied its own difficult middle ground. As the aircraft's co-pilot, Lewis had technically been the officer originally slated to command the mission before Tibbets, as the unit's overall commander, made the decision to fly the lead aircraft himself, a reassignment that some biographers have suggested created a lasting undercurrent of professional friction between the two men, with Lewis reportedly feeling sidelined from full recognition for a mission he had originally expected to lead in his own right. Lewis gave interviews across subsequent decades, in which he described complicated, sometimes contradictory feelings about the mission, oscillating between pride in the technical achievement and expressions of genuine unease about the human cost, a tension that several accounts suggest he never fully or publicly resolved before his death in 1983. Not every man connected to the mission processed his role the way Tibbets did, and the most striking and thoroughly documented contrast comes from a pilot who was not aboard the Enola Gay itself, but flew a closely related supporting mission that morning. Major Claude Eatherly commanded a separate B-29, the Straight Flush, tasked with flying ahead of the Enola Gay to conduct weather reconnaissance over Hiroshima and radio back confirmation that conditions over the target were suitable for the bombing run to proceed. A routine but essential role that placed him among the small group of airmen whose actions that morning directly enabled the mission to go forward as planned. In the years following the war, Eatherly's life took a dramatically different course than Tibbets's, marked by a documented and severe decline involving psychiatric hospitalization, a series of petty crimes and legal troubles, and a persistent, publicly expressed guilt over his role in the Hiroshima mission that he described in numerous interviews, letters, and public statements as an unbearable psychological burden he could not escape. Eatherly became, particularly through a widely publicized exchange of letters with an Austrian philosopher published under the title Burning Conscience, one of the most prominent public faces of anti-nuclear weapons activism connected to the bombing's legacy, presenting himself and being presented by supporters as a man destroyed by genuine remorse for a weapon he had helped unleash on the world. The published correspondence between Eatherly and philosopher Gunther Anders, which brought his case to international attention beginning in the late 1950s, presented Eatherly's guilt and subsequent personal unraveling as a direct moral consequence of his role in enabling the bombing, a framing that resonated powerfully with a growing international anti-nuclear movement in the years following the war, and that made Eatherly, whether he fully sought the role or not, into a kind of living symbol for the argument that the atomic bombings represented a moral catastrophe whose weight fell, in at least this one documented case, with genuine and visible force on a man who had played only an indirect, supporting role in the mission's execution rather than the direct act of releasing the bomb itself. It is worth noting, because the historical record on this point is genuinely complicated, that later psychiatric and historical assessment of Eatherly's case has produced some disagreement over exactly how much of his documented post-war breakdown stemmed specifically and exclusively from guilt over Hiroshima as opposed to broader psychological and personal difficulties that some assessments suggest may have existed independently of, or been only partially connected to, his specific role in the mission. Whatever the precise clinical explanation, Eatherly's case became, and remains, one of the most widely cited examples in public discourse of an airman connected to the atomic bombings, whose life was documented as having been profoundly and visibly altered, for the worse, by the experience. Some historians examining Eatherly's case in the decades since have raised a further complicating question worth including honestly here. Several of his own family members and at least some contemporaries who knew him personally expressed skepticism at the time about how directly his later legal troubles and psychiatric hospitalization were actually connected to Hiroshima specifically, as opposed to reflecting difficulties that may have had other, unrelated origins in his personal life, and that his public association with the bombing's moral weight simply gave a more compelling and internationally resonant explanation for. This does not resolve the question definitively in either direction, but it is a necessary caveat to include for anyone examining his story honestly, since Eatherly's case has often been presented in popular accounts with more narrative certainty about cause and effect than the underlying historical and psychiatric record fully supports. The remaining members of the Enola Gay's actual crew followed paths that fell, in most cases, somewhere between Tibbets's unwavering public defense and Eatherly's documented anguish, generally leaning toward quieter, less publicly examined lives. Thomas Farabee, the bombardier who had physically released the bomb, continued a distinguished military career, later serving during both the Korean War and the Vietnam War, and generally maintained a more private public posture regarding the Hiroshima mission compared to Tibbets's frequent and extensive public commentary, though he did participate in occasional interviews and historical documentation efforts over the following decades. Theodore Van Kirk, the mission's navigator, lived to be the longest surviving member of the Enola Gay's crew, giving numerous interviews in his later decades in which he generally defended the necessity of the mission in terms broadly similar to Tibbets's own reasoning, framing the bombing as a decision that, whatever its horror, had ultimately shortened a war that was killing enormous numbers of people, military and civilian, on a daily basis across the Pacific. Van Kirk died in July of 2014, the last surviving member of the 12-man crew that had flown the mission, and his death was widely covered in the media, specifically because it marked the end of any living first-hand witness testimony from anyone who had actually been aboard the Enola Gay itself on the day of the bombing. Jacob Besser held a unique distinction among everyone connected to the atomic bombing missions. He was the only man to fly aboard both strike aircraft, participating in the Hiroshima mission aboard the Enola Gay, and, 3 days later, the mission against Nagasaki as well, a circumstance arising from his specialized technical role monitoring for potential Japanese radar or radio countermeasures that could interfere with the bomb's detonation mechanism, expertise the mission planners considered valuable enough to include him on both flights. Besser went on to a career as an electrical engineer after leaving military service and, in his own later reflections on the missions, generally offered a measured, technically focused account of his role rather than either Tibbets's forceful public advocacy or anything resembling Eatherly's documented anguish. The Nagasaki mission 3 days later, which Besser also flew, involved its own distinct crew aboard a different aircraft, Boxcar, commanded by Major Charles Sweeney, a mission that encountered its own serious complications, including cloud cover over the primary target, that forced a diversion to the secondary target of Nagasaki itself, and a dangerously low fuel situation on the return flight that required an emergency landing rather than returning directly to the unit's base, on Tinian. The men who flew that second mission faced their own subsequent decades of processing what they had done, generally with far less individual public attention than the Enola Gay's crew received, given that Hiroshima, as the first use of an atomic weapon in warfare, retained a specific historical primacy in public memory that the Nagasaki mission, despite its comparable devastation, never fully matched in terms of sustained public and historical scrutiny of its individual crew members. Karen's photograph of the mushroom cloud, taken from his isolated position in the aircraft's tail turret as the Enola Gay banked away from the target, became, within days of its release, one of the defining visual images of the entire war's conclusion, reproduced in newspapers and magazines around the world, with a frequency that made it, alongside the Iwo Jima flag-raising photograph, among the most widely recognized single images to emerge from the entire Pacific conflict. Caron himself, in later interviews, described the moment of taking the photograph with a kind of professional, almost technical detachment, focused in the instant on correctly operating his camera equipment rather than fully processing the historical and human significance of what he was documenting, a reaction several other crew members described experiencing in their own specific roles, during the mission's most critical moments as well, the demands of their individual technical tasks temporarily overriding any immediate emotional response to what was actually unfolding below them. George Caron, the tail gunner whose photograph of the rising mushroom cloud became one of the most widely reproduced images connected to the entire mission, lived out a quieter post-war life, running a small business, occasionally granting interviews about the mission, but generally avoiding the more extensive and continuous public role Tibbets maintained for decades. Morris Jepson, the assistant weaponeer who had helped arm the bomb in flight alongside Parsons, similarly built a private post-war career in the electronics industry, rarely appearing in the extensive public commemorations and documentary projects that repeatedly sought out Tibbets specifically as the mission's primary and most willing public spokesman across the following decades. Tibbets himself directly addressed this distinction between individual responsibility and broader strategic decision-making on many occasions across his long public life, consistently framing his own role as that of a professional military officer executing an order issued by the legitimate civilian and military leadership of his country. A position he maintained had already weighed the moral and strategic calculations at a level and with an access to information that individual aircrew simply did not possess, and one, he argued, freed him personally from the burden of relitigating that decision every time he was asked about it in the decades that followed. Whether or not one finds this framing morally satisfying, it represented a genuinely consistent position Tibbets held from the war's immediate aftermath, through the final interviews he gave shortly before his death, more than 6 decades later. A consistency that stands in notable contrast to the far more fractured and evolving accounts several of his crewmates gave of their own feelings about the mission across those same decades. The broader historical and ethical debate surrounding the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, a debate that remains genuinely unresolved among historians and ethicists studying the war's final months, continues to inform how the crew's individual post-war paths are understood and discussed today. Some historians point to Tibbets's lifelong, unwavering public defense of the mission as reflecting a considered, sincerely held conviction about the calculus of lives saved versus lives lost in ending the war as quickly as possible, a position shared by several of his fellow crew members, including Van Kirk, in his own later public statements. Others point to Eatherly's documented anguish as evidence that at least some of those most directly connected to the mission's execution experienced a level of genuine, lasting moral distress, that official military and government framing of the bombing as a necessary and clearly justified act never fully addressed or accounted for in how the war's end was subsequently commemorated and taught. What the divergent fates of these men illustrate, perhaps more clearly than any single individual account could on its own, is that even among the small group of airmen most directly and personally connected to one of the most consequential and controversial military actions in human history, there was never a single, uniform way of carrying that experience forward through the remaining decades of their lives. Some found unwavering conviction. At least one found something closer to a life sentence of guilt from which he never fully recovered, and several simply lived quiet, private lives, carrying whatever they personally felt about that August morning, largely unspoken. A reminder that history's most consequential moments are, in the end, lived through by individual human beings who process them in individual and often unpredictable ways. If you want to understand not just the mission that ended the deadliest war in human history, but what happened afterward to the men who carried it out, and how differently each of them lived with what they had done, this is the story worth knowing in full. Subscribe to Pacific War Tales for more long-form World War II history from the Pacific Theater, told with the names, the dates, and the details intact.